to me, like Superhuman is really all about living your best. And so coming in and day out and being able to perform at your best.
I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Be water, my friend.
Boomer, welcome on the Flowgrade Show.
Max, so great to see you again. I always enjoy our conversations and interacting, whether it's on stage at some other events or just whenever we can. It's so good to see you.
Same here, Boomer, and I really have been following your work pretty much for my entire biohacking career, and we worked alongside for so many years and have seen and talked at various events around the world. So I'm very happy to finally present you to our community here. You're really one of the, I'd say, the early innovators in the space. I mean, you've been around since the beginning, I can remember, and you've made a name for yourself, first of all, with your company, Decoding Superhuman, which is a podcast, but also a consulting firm. And nowadays also as the CEO of Transcriptions, or Smarter, Not Harder. And this is the theme for this podcast. So you work alongside extremely intelligent, capable people in the space, and you're one of them as well. And so I'm super happy to have you on. For my first question, I would go back to your initial project, or the one that I kind of associate you with, which is Decoding Superhuman. And in your words, I just want to focus on the second term right now, but what does it mean for you to be superhuman?
Oh, I thought you were going to give me a chance to focus on the first one, but
I will too.
I mean, it's funny that I'm speaking to Max Gotzler, and you think of superhuman, and people like Nietzsche come to mind with the Übermensch, right? And so, but in terms of what I was looking for in, I guess, creating that name, first, it was a little bit of an art experiment, and I can get into how the name actually came about. But when it comes to superhuman, I mean, if you kind of take the literal definition of Übermensch, or the English translation, it's overman, right? And so if you then take superhuman to say, like, okay, how do I perform at or above sort of the top performers in the world? And I was more interested in how you perform above those top performers in the world. So if you have a benchmark of, let's say, how to perform at a certain intellectual level, at a certain physical level, at a certain mental level. When I was conceptualizing Decoding Superhuman, and really that was what the name of the podcast was going to be to start, the idea is how do I dissect ways, tools, tricks, habits, routines by which someone can perform above what is, or break down really how somebody could perform above the best of the best in intellectual capacities as well as physical capacities, and also be sort of a cognitive ninja, if you will. So to me, like, superhuman is really all about living your best. And so coming in and day out and being able to perform at your best. And ultimately, I mean, over the course of several years of exploring that term, a lot of it actually boiled down to presence, believe it or not, but we can get into that a little bit more later.
So presence, you mean mindfulness?
Certainly. Like, I mean, mindfulness is one methodology of getting to presence, but what I found interesting about enjoyment of this life, especially given sort of where I came from in this background that I had in finance, I was working with some of the smartest and most interesting people in the world in finance, and a lot of these people were incredibly smart but all of us were incredibly distracted, right? I remember traveling over the course of 3 years to 40 different countries, eating in countless Michelin star restaurants, and this all sounds kind of ridiculous in hindsight, staying in these really nice hotels, and then afterwards kind of not remembering much about that experience, or being completely distracted from the experience of eating at some of these nice restaurants by the fact that I was sitting there on my BlackBerry. Yes, believe it or not, we still had BlackBerries at that time. Sitting on my BlackBerry. Yeah, exactly. And so, sitting on my BlackBerry at the time rather than enjoying the actual cuisine that we were being served. And so over the course of the several years since starting that Decoding Superhuman project, of course, Superhuman initially is like, okay, how do I perform at my best? How do I perform at my best, both physically and mentally? But over time, what that concept's really evolved to me to is I can be at my best physically and mentally, but in order to actually get 120% of that, a lot of that involved presence. And so, yes, mindfulness is a certain type of meditation that helps bring you there, but there's also many different ways to arrive at that. It's just frankly being able to enjoy this moment with Max Gotzler right now on his podcast without really having to worry about the distractions of various companies that you may have mentioned at the outset of this podcast.
All right. And by the way, I'm sorry to all the listeners because I misled Boomer here a little bit. I gave him the first question and I hinted at asking him about decoding superhuman, and then I changed the question while asking it. But I want to come back to that as well because
Sure.
You kind of gave us the result. And I really like that. The presence is also that the ability to stay in the present, to be in the present is also actually one of the key factors to get into the flow state, which is one of my core concepts that I carry around with me and that I made my mission to show how to get more flow in your life. But I'm pretty sure that there's also a story how you became interested in decoding that. And I'm particularly interested in what was your first touch point with the power of maybe using could be analytics or diagnostics in order to decode being superhuman.
Oh, Max, how far back do we want to go, my friend? This could take us back a ways, and actually, let's go all the way back there. So this is an interesting dichotomy that I lived with growing up, in that my dad was in finance. He worked in operations at a mutual fund, and my mother was a yoga teacher. And so I had a very unique experience where my mother in the early 90s, I would come home and she would be sitting there staring at a wall. And, at first you're a kid, you come into this room and you're wondering why your mother's sitting and staring at a wall. And you're like, is everything okay? But she was meditating. And this was way before things like Headspace or any sort of mass adoption of meditation happened, right? Way before even transcendental meditation made its way into the West. And so I had that experience when I was younger, and I carried that with me into finance. And what I was exposed to in finance was actually these online forums of the quantified self people. So it was quite funny in hindsight, but I was really just searching for how to sleep less, how to look good naked, and how to work more, right? And I was looking for different methodologies to doing that. And I had this exposure through my mother that health could be potentially one of those methodologies. And so I found this online forum, the Quantified Self Institute. It's run by Gary Wolf, who's since become a good friend of mine. And I began interacting with that forum. And what was funny now is that people like Bob Troya, who's Quantified Bob, was on that forum, and they were posting their experiments. And so for me, it started quite easily just sort of associating, okay, how many, at the time I was drinking, so forgive me guys, but how many alcoholic beverages do I have in a night, and like how bad is my sleep? And I would track it in an Excel spreadsheet. And then I would start to make general associations. Okay, on this night I had X number of alcoholic beverages and therefore my sleep was shit. Or on this night this day I had these many cups of coffee and my sleep was X. And so what I generally became more familiar with, and this was actually before Asprey and people like yourself starting pushing that term biohacking, right? And in many ways, quantified self was there early on. They just might have not had as much PR as Asprey did. And so, the whole idea with quantified self and what I got out of that was that feedback loop. And so associating a particular behavior with a sort of a qualitative or quantitative measure, and then being able to improve on that behavior. Later on, what happened was, as with any person who's worked in finance for too long and pushed it too hard, too fast, too soon, I ended up with a heart condition. I very publicly talk about this, and I'm happy to go into it at incredible detail if needed. But I ended up with a heart condition and wasn't very, I guess you can say I wasn't very happy with the results or the feedback that I got with the medical world at that time. And not to say that there's anything wrong with cardiovascular doctors or the medical world. It was just the people I was interacting with were telling me certain things, and I started asking the question, is there another way of doing so? And so what happened was I got very into the data of health, because ultimately, like, my background was in finance. I was okay with very large swaths of data, so to speak, and got into the data of the health. So the omics so these are your genetics, metabolomics, etc., and eventually started to dissect all of that. But really, all of that led to building these various feedback loops on how to improve my health and to go for that health optimization, so to speak. That was a long-winded answer to a very simple question, Max. I'm sorry for doing that.
No, actually, Boomer, I'm super happy you mentioned that, because that also reminded me right now of my beginnings, because also I think we might have even crossed paths without knowing about each other at one of the first Quantified Self conferences in Amsterdam or in San Francisco.
Yeah, so both of them are, San Fran or Amsterdam. I remember that because when I first moved to Amsterdam, I landed here, or it was actually a year after I moved to Amsterdam, but they had their last conference here in Amsterdam several moons back, and it was, we may have interacted in person.
I'm almost sure we did, because these events were still quite small back then.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember also crossing paths with Gary Wolf, Kevin Kelly, and I remember this was the beginning also, like sort of the before event or scene before the biohacking movement.
Mm-hmm.
And even Asprey was there at some of these events. And I remember he was still a one-man show then and handing out bulletproof coffee already, but not on the scale that he then became a bit later,
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of carried that biohacking movement forward. But brings me back, and this also shows you that Boomer right now is one of the innovators, one of the founding members of the whole biohacking scene, because out of this quantified self movement, the first biohackers emerged, and this will carry it forward. And exactly this is also what I started with when I came back to Germany and I was interested in that field. My first endeavor was diagnostics. So I actually, Flowgrade it's still the same company, but it used to be called BioTracker. We changed the name then eventually, and BioTracker was a diagnostics company offering send-home diagnostics and building a dashboard. And this came from interacting with people like you in the quantified self space. So I think that was really interesting. Thank you for taking me back and also the listeners back.
Wow, I didn't know that about you, Max. That's very cool. So BioTracker becomes Flowgrade. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure. And now I'm though, and I think the listeners also would be quite interested in that transition from you being this high-performing financial wizard, let me call you that, to an entrepreneur and a podcaster, and now the CEO of a health company, of a nootropics company. But And you hinted already at some things that happened in your life, but do you remember that point where you said, okay, I have to change something, and where you then kind of changed the itinerary back from maybe the idea of becoming a world-leading financial leader and expert and executive to a biohacker?
Sure. So I'll give everybody listening here just a little bit of my background in finance, because I worked first in New York. Like every kid who graduates university, I went right to Wall Street, or graduates university and wants to work in finance. I went right to Wall Street, and for 2 years I worked myself to the bone. I was working 12 to 18-hour days, sometimes spending the night underneath my desk, or crawling into the bathroom, putting your feet up so nobody would see, to get a 20 to 30-minute nap and then go back to work. And after 2 years, I did that whole not sleeping well, very well, to the point where they sent me to Singapore. And in Singapore, I ran a debt capital markets business focused on South Asia. And so my entire territory was from India to Indonesia. And I would travel all around the world, 40 countries in a handful of years. And I was going to the US 5 times a year. I was in Jakarta at least once a week. I was in India once a month. I was in Europe 12 to 16 times a year. And so, I didn't have this thing called a circadian rhythm, right? And that all came to the fore when I actually elected to leave finance, because I'd done everything that I wanted to. And I was going to go and start my own company, but I was focused on that business traveler and looking at business travelers' health. And initially, when I was leaving, I was going to work on that. It was going to be something similar to ClassPass, but that was when I found out the issue with my heart. And essentially what I'd been diagnosed with was a form of atherosclerosis, and I was 30 years old. Now, cardiovascular disease is the number one preventable cause of death globally. And I kind of looked at my life and said, okay, I'm doing something wrong here, clearly. What else can I be doing? And so I left my job in finance. I actually passed on starting that mobile app because I needed to focus on my health. And that was really that moment where I kind of said, okay, I've had this great life in finance. I've had this fantastic experience of traveling the world. As I alluded to earlier, I wasn't really enjoying much of it, but the writing was on the wall that if I don't do something about this, I could potentially put myself in a hospital at a very young age, or worse, right? And so that was really the moment where I said, it's time to focus on health. It's really time to get to the bottom what this health thing means. Because as I told you, Max, I was really focused on diets. I was really focused on exercise. I was a pretty elite level CrossFit athlete at this point, but I was ignoring my circadian rhythm. I was ignoring stress. I was ignoring, whether or not these diets were right for me. I was just trying whatever Men's Health told me was the diet of the month. And that can lead you down a lot of different rabbit holes, which may or may not be good for you. But it was that moment where I was just turning 30 years old. I was told I needed to have an angiogram, which is a pretty invasive procedure, in order to determine how big of a problem this was. And
it's when they insert a little camera.
It's true. So let's describe an angiogram for people, right? So keep in mind, this is just after my 30th birthday. I'm still living in Singapore, and still probably feeling the effects of my 30th birthday. And the doctor says, hey, we need to do an angiogram. And so what they do is they stick a camera. In the case of my angiogram, it was through my wrist, but they can also do it through your lower abdomen into an artery, and then they go up into your heart. And I just remember distinctly, as the camera goes into the heart, that my heart started skipping a beat. And they look to really figure out just sort of how narrow in my case, the left anterior descending artery was. And so I found out that there was a certain percentage that was narrowed in that because of my lifestyle. And, they basically told me like, hey, you have this condition. We think that, and this is again the opinion of one cardiovascular doctor, and it has no reflection on the rest of the profession. We think that you should go on a statin. Well, the inherent problem with that is that I had a very low cholesterol as it was. It wasn't necessarily cholesterol-induced cardiovascular issue. And so that was when the whole questioning came about. It became, okay, what are the alternatives here? Who are the types of people who've dealt with this in the past? Who are the professionals that I can talk to? What other types of information do I need to know about myself in order to make lifestyle changes? And really, Max, that's what led to me starting a podcast, was because at the time it was the most inexpensive way for me to get in contact with all of these doctors, practitioners, people around the world without having to pay consult fees, to be fair.
Yeah, to be honest, this was sort of the reason why I started my podcast as well. I just wanted to have access to some of the smartest people that I was aware of. And I thought asking them for an interview for a podcast that might also transmit their mission to more people gets me a higher likelihood of them being willing to speak to me rather than asking them just for 15 minutes to ask personal questions. And so this is, I think, what many of the early podcasters can share, that this was a really great way of talking to amazing people.
Absolutely.
So I can relate. Now, Boomer, you were a high performer, but you also are a high performer right now. You are the CEO of a company. You travel around the world. You go to conferences. You speak on stage. And this is sort of a broader question now, but now in comparison to this, I'd say, really excruciating lifestyle from the finance world, like kind of this work hard, party hard, and sacrifice sleep in order to get more in, be more productive. How would you say, have you changed in terms of balancing these intense periods, the deep work sessions, with recovery? I intentionally don't say work and, personal life, because I think for us, sometimes these are intertwined.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that you always shut off completely, but how do you maintain a balance?
Yeah. So you hit a good word there, Max, and you kind of alluded to an approach that both you and I probably have here. And I wanted to touch on that first, and then I'll go into the routines and sort of the tactics that developed as a result of this. So when you say the word work-life balance, which is really a trend that came from, we don't know the root of it, but I suspect it's sort of a human resources department of some corporation. And it started coming into common parlance in sort of the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so when you say balance, that immediately implies a trade-off, right? And so there are very few moments in your life where you're going to have the work and the life equally in balance. In fact, it's something that you're always striving for, and it's quite hard to get, which can create in itself a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And so for those people out there listening, I was one of those also who was struggling with that term for a very long time, work-life balance. Because clearly, if somebody had created this term, there were people out there that had achieved this thing called work-life balance. And after interviewing countless number of people and talking to tons of executives around the world, I can almost assure you that none of them have achieved work-life balance for a prolonged period of time. And so the term that I prefer is actually work-life integration, meaning that there's a seamless flow between your work and your life. And that was a term which was actually presented to me by Dr. Ted Achacoso, and clearly him and I talk a lot, but it was a term that really resonated well. Yeah, he is, and I'm no. Like you make a go ahead.
Just I met him in London, where you were as well, and then I remember because he's known for having an extremely high IQ. I think he's open about that, and then. I think someone asked him, I was in a group of people, how high his IQ is. And then he said, on a good day, 178, on a bad day, 182. I thought that was just such a smart answer. And he is the founder of Health Optimization and also of the company that you work for, that you're the CEO of, which is Smarter Not Harder. And so I kind of envy you a little bit, Boomer, of being around him and Scott Schur, the other founder, all the time, because I consider the two of them also as some of the smartest people we can learn from.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of health on the planet.
Absolutely. And, it's funny is not to correct you, Max, but on a good day, and Ted refers to good as days where he's relatable to people, his IQ is somewhere around 185. And on a bad day, which is when he says he's not relatable to people, his IQ is somewhere around 210. And so he's statistically, you can map this, he's statistically one of the top 25 smartest people on this planet, if you take IQ as sort of the means of interpreting that, right? And so just going back to the idea of work-life integration here, because when I heard that term, I was like, oh, of course, like that's just it. It's so simple. And the ability to kind of flow easily between work and life is something that just resonated with me. In order to do that, though, you do have to have a few things going for you. You have to have, and I'm very fortunate enough to have these. Right. So I think first and foremost, selecting the right type of partner in life is certainly one of those things that's required. So I'm very fortunate that Bessie, my wife, we have this very work-life integrated relationship, meaning that there are days and times, and they may seem odd to most people, where we'll just go out for coffee and we'll just be by ourselves. But there's also dates and times, or even on the weekends, where both of us will be doing work, and sort of that seamless flow between work and life that, if you can get it, actually is a very significant stress relief, right? Because you're no longer striving for this term that may seem obtuse to a lot of people, like work-life balance, that is fundamentally, like, inherently implying a trade-off. And so if you're fundamentally implying a trade-off, it means that the times where you're going to be happy and stuck in the spot of work-life balance are going to be few and far between. But coming back to the actual question that you asked, Max, which is just sort of how I've changed my life to allow for the elements of work-life integration. And first, I think there's an element in here that is routine, and I'll talk a little bit about the routines first. The routines that I developed in finance, of course, those are useful, right? Like getting up every day and reading the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, etc. Going to the gym, those become very, very useful. But reconstructing those routines so that they're more sustainable, because a lot of my life right now is still built into doing work. Like I'm still a tremendously, I would categorize myself as a high performer, and if anything, my performance has improved over the years because I'm much more calculated with how I spend my time, and much more present with that time, right? And so if presence makes you more effective, I mean, we've all read Cal Newport's book on deep work. Like, presence can make you incredibly effective for the allotted time period to a given task. And so, an emphasis on presence has certainly helped that. But the routines that I've developed as a result that helped with this whole element of work-life integration and improving balance, I have a time period which is before 11 a.m. And if you actually try to look at my calendar, it's very hard to block me for any sort of meeting before 11 a.m. And why is that? Well, I actually got this idea from Jeff Bezos, believe it or not. And so Bezos, who at any given point in time is the richest man in the world, or in the top 3, right? Max? I don't know what he is today. It really depends on Amazon's stock price, right? And so Bezos came up. Yeah, exactly. And so Bezos has this thing called putzing. And at first I read that and I was like, putzing? Really?
How do you write that?
Yeah, Putzing. And so putzing is, in English, we would kind of think of the term as time where you're spent doing, it's sort of undirected time, meaning that it's not very strict or regimented what you're doing. And so I read that Bezos does putzing, and I'm like, okay, so he putzes around, and this is a guy who runs a multi-trillion-dollar company, and he's not really... before 10 a.m., he spends a lot of time just sort of doing random tasks around the house, no real checklist, whatever. And so I took that idea to heart, and I was like, okay, can I give myself permission to putz? Can I give myself permission to be random? And so every day before 11 a.m., I have 3 things that I really need to get done, and that's it. And it depends really on when I wake up, but those 3 things that I need to get done are meditation, are some sort of deep learning, and so spending 2 to 3 hours a day reading, learning about a subject. I think right now all of my focus has been on artificial intelligence, given everything that's going on with ChatGPT and Baird and all these kind of tools that are coming out. And then 3 is working out. And so I have that time before 11 a.m. to putz with some guardrails on it. So no matter what happens during the day, I know I have those 3 things done. And so it's just get my workout in. And, Max, I'm not a professional basketball player like you, but I still like to work out quite a bit. And then, I get...
know a little bit about some of the details. Like, what kind of workouts do you prefer? What do you do?
Sure.
I'm interested.
Yeah, I've got it structured into 2 different types. And there's sort of the on-the-road types, and I'll talk a little bit about that workout, and because I think it's particularly interesting for people who have live in a time-constrained environment. And then there's the at-home types. And so the on-the-road types, what those workouts look like, and how I began to come up with this programming was sitting with the question, if I only had 20 minutes in a day, what would I do for workouts? And so I broke this down into 3 to 4 different types of exercises. The first is every minute on the minute. And then, so you do every minute on the minute for 8 minutes, and you choose from one of 3 types of lifts. And those are the deadlift, the bench press, and the squat. And so every minute on the minute, you choose from those 3 types of lifts. And then the accessory lifts are using blood flow restriction training, which I'm sure you've talked to a number of different people on the podcast about that. And then you find...
Not so much as you might... I talked to Andreas, but on the podcast so far, not so much. But it's
certainly... So blood flow restriction training is a fascinating topic, right? Because if you think about 20 minutes of time that you have to spend... and I've already taken out 8 minutes of it, you now have 12 minutes left to finish your training. And blood flow restriction training introduces an element of hypoxia. It shows a tremendous amount of benefits to things like muscle growth, but also recovery and growth hormone production. And so you're wearing these bands around your biceps, essentially between where your biceps and your shoulder connect, as well as on your thighs. And you're going through a series of exercises, typically 3, for 20 to 25 reps, and you're doing it with a relatively low weight, like to the point where you would wonder, why is Boomer holding 5 kilo weights or 2.5 kilo weights, even in certain cases, right? And so these can be tremendously effective for an allotted time period. And then I wrap up that exercise with a session that I call gut. And so that's just abs and core and that kind of stuff. And so that's all my 20-minute travel regimen. And then the kind of, when I'm in Amsterdam regimen, it looks a little bit different. And so I do like to...
By the way, just a quick question, Boomer.
Sure.
So because the exercises you mentioned, they require weights. What do you do when you don't have a gym to access or any weights, or just take them with you?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of things you can do, right? So I used to travel with the X3 bar. I don't travel so much with it anymore because you have to check a bag. And so in the event that, let's actually break that down, because in the event that you don't have any weights, what can you do? One of my favorite things to do, and I think somebody made this famous with the Moby song Flower, is to do either air squats or push-ups to a song. And if you recall the song Flower with Moby, it's bring Sally up, bring Sally down. Yeah. And you're just basically following the lyrics to the song and doing a movement with it. There's several other songs you can do this with. You can do it with Taylor Swift. You can do it with Ricky Martin. Like, choose your pick and just pick the phrase, right? It can be quite a lot of fun. And so that would actually substitute sort of very well for the deadlift, the push-up, the bench press, and the squat. Now, the blood flow restriction bands are beautiful because you can travel with them anywhere, and they fit in a carry-on bag. Like, they just go in the corner of the carry-on bag, and you can bring them anywhere. So in the event that you don't actually want to do the song, you can actually get a pretty good workout in 5 to 10 minutes on your blood flow restriction bands without them, right? And so I think that is a great way to go through travel. The other thing I would suggest for people is that when you're traveling, pick your hotel by the gym. And that's something that's I've been guided by quite a bit. And, just having a simple set of free weights, a cardiovascular machine will go a long way. So that's my travel workout. And again, I work with a lot of high performers, similar people to what you work with, Max. Like, I work with executives, hedge fund managers, private equity people, and predominantly entrepreneurs who they just don't have time. And that framework of just the 8-minute EMOM to start, the blood flow restriction training, and then gut at the end, that is something that most of my clients have been able to implement 4 times a week without any sort of issues.
By the way, quick question to the 8 minutes, because you say every minute on the minute. But does that mean you have 1 minute and then 1 minute rest? Because I like the Tabata style workouts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I do 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, 30 seconds on, 10 seconds off. How does that look with 1 minute? Is that 1 minute on, 1 minute off?
So I usually guide people to say, so every minute on the minute is, so you'll complete a certain number of reps. That's usually between 8 and 12, and then you'll rest for the remaining period of the minute. And so let's say I'm doing push-ups. I'll do 12 push-ups, which will probably take me, if I'm doing them to a certain count, maybe 30 seconds, and then I'll have 30 seconds to rest before I go back again and do the same thing.
I get it.
And so you can play with the rep number. I generally guide people to higher reps rather than lower reps because the tendency, of course, with people who, if you say, like, I only want you to do 3 reps in a minute, they're going to try and put as much weight as possible on there. And for most entrepreneur types, they already have too much stress in their life. And so having an exorbitant amount of nervous system stress due to trying to do a 3-rep max of a deadlift is probably not a good idea.
Get it. All right. So we have the workout part on the road. I think you wanted to mention your Amsterdam.
Yeah, so the Amsterdam are just sort of the home workouts, or when I know I'm going to have a more consistent gym experience. I will try to get some zone 2 training in there. And so zone 2, this requires you to have some knowledge of what your maximum heart rate is. But for me, that's somewhere between 130 and 140 beats per minute is zone 2 training. And I'll try to go for 20 minutes to 45 minutes. I have a Carol bike at home, but I don't actually use the Carol bike for what it was intended for, which is the 2 20-second sprints. I use it instead for zone 2 training. I will try to do 2 to 3 zone 2 sessions a week. Zone 2, for those who are unaware, the person to look up on this is Ignacio, apologize if I say his name wrong, Samilan. He is a Tour de France coach, but he's also a professor at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And he does a lot he actually suggests doing 45 minutes or more zone 2 training. For most entrepreneurs, I tend to find that that's not really practical. So just doing 20 to 45 minutes, that could certainly work. Now, I'll do some elements of zone 2 training, so that's 2 to 3 times a week when I'm here in Amsterdam. I'll also do a couple of strength training sessions. So that would look very much like, as I described before, those EMOM sets, plus a few accessory lifts at a regular gym, plus gut. And actually what I've become interested more in training lately, and this is actually due to a failed experiment on my part, which I could talk about later, is the neck. And so looking at different ways to train neck muscles. I do have a dream of someday becoming a Formula One driver. I'm not sure if that's reality at all. I'm not built that way, but training the neck has been certainly very helpful in my own life.
Yeah, let me ask you what you do, because I actually also started training my neck a little bit with bands. Like I kind of tied just a normal workout stretch band to my balcony, and then I either do almost like pushbacks with my neck, having that band kind of build some resistance, and then I do the front part and the side part. I know some people wrap a weight into a towel and actually put it on the side of their head while they're lying down on some sort of, either on the ground or
on a bench or something like this.
On a bench. And then they work that way. I know there are certain head trainers, but what is your preferred method?
Do any of the first two. Really, it's just a matter of convenience. So when I'm traveling with the blood flow restriction bands, I'll also bring a lightweight resistance band with me. And so I'll use that for neck training. But, there are devices out there like the Iron Neck. I've seen some of the stuff that the F1 guys use, which, to be fair, most of them just use, they have a trainer hold the resistance band and then they try and stabilize their neck. But both of those seem to work, Max. I do occasionally use plates because that is just a matter of convenience, but you have to be careful with the amount of weight on the plate, because remember, if you haven't trained your neck before, it's a little bit of an interesting feeling. So like anything, whether it's supplements or weights, start low and then kind of titrate your way up.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting muscle to train. You usually don't have that on the agenda when you begin with normal weight training. But I also always admire the people that have good-looking, strong necks, because it also looks imposing. Kind of your body posture corrects itself. You look a little bit more confident, like just by looking at it. I could imagine that there's also a feedback loop with power posing and having a strong neck in a way.
I'm sure. Max, I think Max just told all of us here that we're going to have both Max and I are going to have huge necks come Flow Fest this year. I'm joking.
That's the plan. Let's do it before and after pic.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Boomer, now what I understand so far, we talked about fitness now a lot, but before 11 a.m., I want to kind of dial back a little bit to that one. You take care of your body and mind. Now, we talked about mostly about body, even though workout obviously also has some effects on your mental health. But you mentioned two other things, meditation and learning. Can you maybe tell me what do you do to meditate? Do you use any app or any helpful device, maybe even the Muse? I know we both are interested in neurofeedback in some sort.
Yeah.
What do you do in that realm?
Wow. The answer to your question is a lot, but we'll kind of break it down into things that I've done and things that I'm currently doing. But I always want to set out the reasons why beforehand. And so why does this element of putzing or free time with some guardrails before 11 a.m. work for me? Well, I've spent most of my...
I love that term, by the way. I know that concept, putzing. It's amazing.
I stole it from somebody, but who also probably stole it from somebody else. And so the idea here is, how do I put myself into a state where I can go out and kick ass in my life, but not be thrown for a loop or the victim of emails, text messages, things that could be distractions, right? Because we've all had those situations where an event comes up in the middle of the day. Sometimes these are unavoidable. And it throws you completely off for the rest of the day. So the reason why I have this time before 11 a.m. is because it helps get me in the right mindset. It helps get me in the right ability to produce. It helps increase my productivity so that when people come online from the United States, either later in the day or I need to perform during the day, I'm in that right spot. And so the mind certainly comes with that. And what I've found about myself, and this is generally true with a lot of men, is that my testosterone levels rise significantly in the morning, right? And so if your testosterone levels rise significantly in the morning, as does cortisol, there is this egoic state that you become in. And so that egoic state, if you're in the midst of email, if you're in the midst of working, can produce a lot of anger. It can also produce a lot of distraction. And so the introduction of meditation has certainly helped with that. It's also certainly helped with that goal of presence. Now, right now, I am using the Waking Up app by Sam Harris as my predominant source of guided meditations. Also, we have... among our little friend base, an artist in Slovenia who's produced this awesome gamma meditation track that's like 45 minutes long, and it's supposed to help with getting your brain into a gamma state, which is, think of that as those brain waves as sort of the similar frequencies to what longer term Buddhist meditators have been able to achieve. And so we have tracks like that. I have the Waking Up app, and those predominantly serve as my ways of meditation. Yes, you mentioned a couple of key points about meditation that I've used in the past. And so when I was first getting started in meditation, the thing that helped most was accountability. And so I was one of these people when I was living in Singapore who paid the money to go and do transcendental meditation. One of the reasons why I paid the money was because they kept me accountable to doing meditation twice a day for 20 minutes. And that was incredibly helpful to start. And so just getting somebody to help build in that habit pattern or form that habit was really, really helpful. Then I moved on to the Muse because the Muse provided that biofeedback. Now, it's been a while since I've used that device, but at that time, it was providing feedback when you're in an alpha state and there would be birds chirping. And I, like any other competitive person, wanted to hear more birds chirping. And so that was certainly a helpful device in order to get myself into that meditative mindset. But over the course of the time, and then due to some of the people that I met over the course of that journey, I began to practice more of a non-dualistic form of meditation. And that ultimately led me to listening to Sam Harris quite a bit and following and using his Waking Up app, which offers 10 or 20 minute meditations that you can use throughout your day, really.
Very interesting. I actually never really used the Muse, but I have a similar experience with a person that we also both know and we talked about actually in our pre-talk to that podcast, which is Dr. James Hart, who is the founder of BioCybernaut, and I thought also I had a very similar experience. Whereas you heard birds chirping, I heard different instruments, which referred to the different parts of my brain, the different the occipital lobe or the central lobe. And whenever there was alpha activity detected, you heard the sounds a bit louder. And I had that similar experience that whenever I thought, oh, cool, let's make them even louder, whenever I thought that or got into that egoic state that you called before, then the music actually turned less loud. So it almost disappeared, because then you were getting into your egoic state, which oftentimes interferes with the alpha wave. So that is very interesting. I want to ask you, would you recommend right now, because actually I asked Dr. James Hart and he said, well, the Muse is certainly an interesting device, but it is not really accurate as of now. But based on your experience, would you recommend people to try it out?
So this can be extrapolated in terms of like other quantified self devices too, because I'm sure, Max, you get asked all the time, like, should I have a Whoop? Should I have an Oura Ring? Should I have a Garmin, whatever, right? And if I were to kind of extrapolate it to other quantified self devices, the question I always ask people is what's going to motivate you to do the task at hand? And if birds chirping in your ear motivates you to do the task at hand, then sure. I think almost universally now we've concluded that meditation is a good habit for people to have. And if it requires you to go out and buy a device that has some questions around accuracy, but you know that going full into it, and it allows you to build that habit of meditation, then I do think it's useful. The same goes for another quantified self-device which may not measure sleep as accurately as another. If you prefer to have a wristband rather than a ring, then okay, the Whoop might be a better choice for you than the Oura, as long as it helps bring awareness to what you're doing. And so whether or not it's the Muse or Headspace or Waking Up or whatever app, it's just whatever motivates you to start changing your behavior, go for it. Sorry, I'm not trying to dodge your question, but it's. I think it's a great way to just not lose the trees from the woods, so to speak, right? You just want to be able to complete the task at hand, build the habit, and then we can adjust on the fly whether or not it's the Muse or Waking Up app or something else.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting devices. I have some experience with the Neurovisor, for example, and the Muse never just so far has made it here for me, but I'm very eager to try it out. That's why I'm asking. And no, thanks for sharing it. But I think, you know, as biohackers, this is sort of our job description, just to try.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure, like you, my room in here, which Bessie made me put all of my devices into one room, right? And so that they wouldn't clutter the rest of the house. And my room is littered with devices that I've tried. And I think what ultimately something I wasn't comfortable with at the beginning, but now I'm much more comfortable with, is there may be a device that is good for you right now in the state that you're in, but in 6 months' time, you may need another device. It's quite an expensive way to go through biohacking, but the fact is that the device that is good for you now to get you to that next step may not be the device that'll carry you all the way through.
That's it. And sometimes also the opportunity arises. For example, our mutual friend Andreas Breitfeld here in Munich has a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. And I just like going to that in order to further my regeneration and recovery. And especially in high-stress times, and when I have a lot on my plate, I love going there. And I probably wouldn't go there if there wasn't an opportunity. I wouldn't go out and just buy or, you know, try to get a hyperbaric chamber. First of all, I don't have the room, and it's very expensive. But then oftentimes there are opportunities. And like you said before, it was there before as well, but right now I noticed I actually could need some extra recovery. And so now I'm going to visit our friend from now on about twice a week in order to do that. So
maybe I'll have to come and join you, but not in the same hyperbaric machine at the same time.
Oh, yeah, we'll for sure have a session. No, we then go to the whatever. He has so many devices, so we can try that out. But what you referred to also, I just wanted to touch on that because many people also, I mean, I'm sure you have that same, many clients that hear about all these things. They want to do everything at once. And what I always tell them is like try to then just relax, because when the idea is there, oftentimes you will attract it into your life one way or the other. Either the opportunity will come, but maybe like try to avoid forcing it, because I think that is usually where things then tend to go wrong or expectations arise that are not being met. But when it feels natural and nice, kind of sort of in the flow of life, we talked about flow before, but when it comes into your life and it feels right to do it, then do it. And that approach works for me. And it is tied also a little bit to what you described as presence. Mm-hmm. Because when you have that presence, you all of a sudden notice things that are in your environment that you can use in order to help you with one thing or the other that you're
absolutely
at that time.
I mean, what you just described, there's a, what's funny is that I tried to read the Tao Te Ching probably 10 to 15 years ago, right? Like I tried to read the Tao Te Ching 10, 15 years ago, and I was just, maybe more like 15 years ago, I was just not in a place where I understood it. I'm like, okay, thousands of people have read this book and said it's the book that's changed their life. And then I read it probably 5-6 years ago, and I'd have to agree with them. Like the book has so many good insights. And if you take another book from Taoism, the Zhuangzi, which there they articulate that concept of Wu Wei, which is the effortless flow. I think there's a lot that can be said with that. And so rather than, fighting so hard to go against the current, which I would describe most of my professional life as what I did, being able to accept where you are right now, be there with full presence, knowing full well, and this takes some level of confidence, comfort, and faith that what is right for you will show up, is certainly a good way to approach it. But again, that takes a lot of that's taken a lot of sort of self-study and beating into my own head over the course of the years, because I think from a Western standpoint, we're very much on the set goal, achieve goal, set goal, achieve goal. And before you achieve the next goal, you're already setting your next goal after that, right? And so reversing a lot of that social cultural programming is quite difficult. And, it takes a lot, certainly a lot of work. But to go back to your original point, stacking so many things on your plate so that you're unable to do one of them, or the classic one is New Year's resolutions, right? Where people say, I'm going to go to the gym every single day, and then they go 3 days in a row, they're sore, and they're like, okay, I'll take the day off, and then the day off becomes 6 months off. That's just a classic one, right? And so practicing the element of micro habits and layering in those technologies, those tools, those behavior changes over time is certainly a much... while it may seem like you're leaving a lot on the table initially, consistency is key, and knowledge and behavior changes compound over time, and that can lead to a very different you in a few months.
By the way, I think I've hardly ever took so many notes as already to this point with you, Boomer. So I just want to refer to the fact that these notes will be online in the show notes. Don't worry, people. Don't worry, listeners. Whatever Boomer has shared so far is not being lost. Only, in case you don't remember, you can go to the show notes on flowgrade.de/podcast. You'll find the podcast there, and the show notes will be online. Boomer, I want to switch gears a little bit, because maybe at that point I can also share that you will be a speaker this year at FlowFest 2023. Because I'm pretty sure so far the listeners have already understood that pretty much any subject we dive into, we could fill a whole podcast with.
I mean, it's mostly the host, right? And so Max, you're asking some fantastic questions, and sometimes I'm like, okay, nobody's ever asked me that before. I need to think about that a little bit, or I'll just start talking, and eventually the answer will come out. But this has been an awesome session, my friend.
I mean, there's so many things I could really dive into. You mentioned before, just on a side note, that, for example, the partnership is so important as a foundation. I could talk about that. You talked about putzing, about meditation, you workout. But there's actually one thing, because this kind of leads to where I wanted to go from the beginning. Speaking of putzing, taking that time for yourself, you're sort of ensuring that then when you are focusing, concentrating on something that you want to dive into, maybe creating something, let's call it that. The other is preparation, learning, and then you go into crafting. Then you are prepared. Then you are able to be present. And now for the remainder of this podcast, I kind of want to talk about that next stage. So after 11 a.m. So
sure.
Let me ask you, so what happens after 11 a.m.?
So as I'm approaching 11 a.m., I'll sit down at some point and write down the battle plan for the day. And usually that includes, what meetings I have, what I need to get done, who I need to contact, those kind of things. And so as I'm kind of coming into 11 a.m., you can picture me as sort of like an attack dog drooling almost, right? Like I'm ready to just go out and take the day. And so I have my battle plan, and I'm going into, at that point, just execution. And so perhaps I'll spend a moment on that battle plan, because I think the battle plan is quite crucial if you want to be productive. There's a book by Gary Keller called The One Thing. And The One Thing is, it's probably the best productivity book I've ever read. Not in the sense, like most productivity books can be summed up in a couple of pages, right? And I think there's a German company called Blinkist that does this very well, where they give cliff notes of books, and you can go through them in 5 to 10 minutes. And so if you want a quick way to go through books and get the main idea, like Blinkist is a great one. I'm sure ChatGPT has this function as well. And over the course of, GPT-4 and all of these other artificial intelligence or generative AI, you'll be able to get cliff notes at a much faster rate. But Gary Keller's book, The One Thing, made a lot of sense to me, in the sense that battle plan, I do spend 5-10 minutes sitting there and saying, what is that one thing that I can do today which will either have the most impact, meaning it will cause a lot of other things to just become easier in the future, or it will set the path or set the course for something that Transcriptions is doing 6 months from now, or Health Optimization Medicine and Practice is doing 4 to 6 weeks from now, etc. Or what is that one thing that if I do it, 5 other things become irrelevant? So I think spending 5 to 10 minutes on just deciding what that one thing is certainly useful. And then you just put that at the top of your battle plan.
You do that every day?
I do it. I mean, look, it would be dishonest to say every day. There are certain days where I'm not perfect, and I need to either put out some fires or whatever it is, but I try my best to every day identify what that one thing is. And that one thing might be a project that's going to take me several weeks to complete, but I keep it at the top of that list because I'm going to dedicate a certain portion of my then working hours, which can stem quite late into the evening, dedicated towards making sure that that project comes to fruition. And so again, spending a moment to just identify what that one thing is, who's that one person I need to contact, et cetera, et cetera. And so once you have that one thing, you can also break it down into action steps. And so what's the one thing that goes into the one thing? And Gary Keller's book summarizes this in a beautiful way. And he actually gives, I think it's 7 different categories where you can have one things in. And these can be anything from spirituality to avocation to vocation, et cetera. But for me, I sit down and really focus on vocationally. What is that one thing that will deliver 10x the results of me doing anything else? And that's really, when I hit that battle plan, that's really where I launch off at 11 a.m. I try to dedicate at least 1 hour to that one thing before even hopping on Zoom calls. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but I will make sure to reserve a certain amount of time for that one thing throughout the day. The other thing that really works well for me is time-restricted feeding. And this is something that's not, you wouldn't think it's necessarily related to getting shit done, but time-restricted feeding, it helps control the blood sugar. It certainly helps me plan the rest of my day so that I know in certain periods I'll get meals, but in other periods I'll just have intense dedicated time to work. And so time-restricted feeding is incredibly helpful. From that
How
period.
often do you eat per day?
I still eat 3 times a day. And so my first meal is typically around 11 or 12. I then have a second meal, and the second meal is usually a bit smaller, around 3 or 4. And then my last meal is between 6 and 7.
All right.
But having the battle plan, time-restricted feeding, and then, one of the things that I like to do is at the end of the day, kind of do a little bit of a recap as to what I've got done. And that could serve as a mini gratitude session in many ways. Like, thank you for, being able to do all of these things. But also to just write down, okay, here are my top priorities, for the next day, because that also makes setting that battle plan the next day a little bit easier. And so based on what I know that evening, what do I think that the battle plan is going to indicate the next day? And those are really just a couple of key things that I found to be incredibly useful. Also, making time for walks and going outside during the day. Right after we're done recording this podcast, Max, I'm going to go for a little bit of a long walk. It's a beautiful day here in Amsterdam, which is rare. And so I need to take advantage of
this time at least.
Yeah, exactly. It's rare. And so, Amsterdam, at least if you believe the almanacs, gets about 70 days of sunlight a year. And so any day the sun goes out, I would venture to guess that the Dutch economy slows down. And so I need to be one of those people that goes outside today and enjoys the sun. But I'll go for a long walk. Sometimes those walks will include calls. But I try to spend as much time outside as possible throughout the day. And, there's numerous other mini routines I have throughout the day, which I can get into, but those are just sort of several ones which I've found to make me very effective during my day.
Well, we could get into them, and I'm sure it would be very interesting also for me, but the thing is then we would sit here tomorrow morning and you would not go on your walk. That's why I think by the way, I want to let you go, and I'd say about 10 minutes at the latest. So
I'm all good, Max. Whatever you need, my friend.
There's one thing as the head of a nootropics company. Obviously, I cannot let you go before getting into that a little bit more.
Sure.
But one last question regarding that battle plan. Do you limit yourself to a certain number of minutes of deep work? Because according to the newest research, it says you can maybe have around 4.5 hours of really concentrated work per day. And this is already a lot. Like most people don't even get the 90 minutes. But then do you have a cutoff point nowadays where you say, okay, I'm going to stop at a certain time or after a certain amount of work?
Sure. Well, keep in mind my before 11 a.m. time, I'm spending 2 hours studying different topics, things I want to learn.
That's right.
things
You already
that
have some.
I do think are useful in potentially my future as a business person, as an entrepreneur, et cetera, skills I want to build. And as I alluded to earlier, one of the things I'm spending a lot of time on now is what is the impact of generative AI on the health world. And, I dedicate a certain amount of time to that in that pre-11 a.m. time. But to answer your question, perhaps with something that that someone can use listening to this, what I found most effective for me is the Pomodoro technique. And so the Pomodoro technique is interval training for productivity nerds. And so the traditional Pomodoro is a 25-minute work period followed by a 5-minute rest period. And the encouragement there with that rest period is to completely walk away from your work for 5 minutes. And then within that 25-minute period, you're dedicated to one specific task. Now, I can push that, and I find that a lot of people can push that a little bit longer, but most people cannot push it beyond 90 minutes. And so if you're going to push it longer than 25 minutes, I would try and keep that proportion for your work rest period. So if you're going to go 50 minutes, then do 10 minutes of rest and give yourself a little bit of a rest. You can use it to go walk outside like I do, or you can use it to go get a bite to eat or something like that. But those work rest intervals certainly work quite well in my life. If you're a person who's a trader on Wall Street or you work on a trading floor, perhaps that isn't available to you. And so you can look at things like deep work sessions before your workday starts to help build that skill set. And using sort of 60 to 90 minute blocks is certainly very helpful for a lot of those types of people.
All right. No, great advice. I actually used the Pomodoro technique for many years. I kind of switched to that 90-minute rule where I try to give myself 90 minutes. It's not always 90 minutes that will work, but this is sort of my cutoff point. And then I see whenever I get done with a task, I take a break oftentimes, or that could be after 25 minutes, but very interesting. All right, Boomer. Let's shift gears one last time because I am also interested, and by the way, I'm also really excited to have you in Munich, and I can already feel that the listeners also are excited to meet you in person and then talk to you, ask you questions. So please, if you want to meet Boomer, come to Munich on July 7th till 9th for FlowFest. He will be there. He'll give a keynote, and he'll also be around during the days, and certainly available for questions, I hope.
Available for questions. I'll probably have a handful of trochees available as well. So, Max, I'm hoping you'll volunteer yourself to have a blue tongue during the weekend, but we'll make sure that everybody has a chance to try transcriptions.
Of course. And now we are at the topic that I want to hit now last, which is nootropics, because I had Scott Schur on, so some of the listeners might be aware what the blue tongue refers to. Mm-hmm. But first question is, do you use trochees every day for work?
So I take, one of our products is called Just Blue, and Just Blue is 16 milligrams of methylene blue, and it's delivered in that buccal trochee format. Sorry for that background noise, but it's delivered in that buccal trochee format. However, Just Blue is one of our products that you can actually swallow. And so I do take Just Blue every single day. It's a micro amount of methylene blue, but I find that I derive benefits both from the ATP production, so energy, but also the benefits to memory. And also it's an antimicrobial and an antiviral. And so during this, I guess you can say, flu type season, it helps protect me. It helps boost my immune system. And I do take our products every single day.
I like them a lot. One question I have to ask, because we're in Germany. In Germany, it's not so easy to get them. I mean, obviously there were a couple of possibilities. But what is the status there right now? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So It's look, I would love to have them in the European Union. Frankly, as I spend half of my time in the European Union right now, it's a shame that Triscriptions is not available here. But a lot of the issue is with the regulation, and specifically the Novel Food Act. And what the Novel Food Act states is that prior to, I believe, 1997, or there's a list of foods that were governed under the Novel Food Act in 1997, and methylene blue is not one of those. Even though methylene blue was the first drug approved by the FDA in the 1890s, it's been a part of our medical system for decades now, and has been served as both has been used as a diagnostic tool, or it's also still used in hospitals for the treatments of septic shock, etc. It's not on the Novel Food Act, and so we can't use it or we can't sell it here in the European Union. That's the only reason why we don't have Triscriptions available to you. But I promise, Max, I will bring some to FlowFest.
No, amazing news. And I also want to refer the listeners to the episode with Dr. Scott Scher, your colleague at Triscriptions, because in that episode we go into detail into the different compounds of your products at Triscriptions, which is carnitine blue or just blue. And because we don't have the time right now to go into that.
Sure.
But I would love to also talk about that. But knowing that you take that, and methylene blue, by the way, I find that one of the most interesting compounds that I've come across in the last years, because that also for me was new. And if you want to see a lot of biohackers with blue tongues, then I recommend to everyone who hasn't been, go to a biohack event. Oftentimes, Boomer has some supply there to make your tongue blue and then feel the benefits. But Boomer, I have another question. Do you have any other supplements that help you focus more, that you are a fan of, that you like using? Doesn't have to be on a natural daily basis, but something that you really count on?
Sure. When I speak about this, I kind of want to give people different situations by which I use different products. And I'm actually looking right now. I have an old wine fridge in my house, which has been converted into a supplement fridge. And so I have ingredients from China, Russia, South Africa, a whole bunch of other places in there. And so I'm just looking at, if you see me looking down and to the left now, I'm actually just trying to refresh my memory as to what I use for specific situations. But first things first, I think it's very helpful for anybody to go through rounds of testing with a professional. The nonprofit, and again, I derive no salary from this, it's a nonprofit, but Health Optimization Medicine and Practice, the practitioners there know how to optimize basic cell function. And we do that through testing metabolomics and giving nutrient and hormone balancing recommendations. The reason why I say that first is because if your cells are not optimized, your nutrients are not balanced, your hormones are not balanced, there's only so far that these nootropics are going to take you. And in fact, Dr. Ted put together, and Max, I can send this to you as sort of a follow-up here. He put together a great lecture which covers how we at Triscriptions look at nootropics. And just to kind of give you the categories here, we have health optimization nootropics, and these are any agent, influence, or lifestyle that really helps optimize the health of the cell. We also have performance optimization nootropics. That's the focus of the performance of the cell without regards necessarily to the health of the cell. And then we have this third category, which is named bluetropics. And we named it bluetropics because methylene blue is sort of the exemplary of this class. And so bluetropics are molecules that do both. And so let's assume that you have your basic cells optimized and you've worked with your health optimization medicine and practice practitioner to do so, or whomever. What are some of the other compounds that could be useful for you? When it comes to health optimization nootropics, remember I said lifestyle, so things like sleep. If your sleep sucks, that's certainly not going to that's certainly going to get in your way of performing well. But on the performance optimization side, things that I use quite regularly, nicotine. Nicotine binds to acetylcholine receptors in the body and releases a whole host of neurotransmitters. But I find it works very well for things like verbal fluency. It works incredibly well in weightlifting workouts where you have to do a lot of coordination. And so anything with hand-eye coordination, it tends to work very well for me there as well. I have used, just looking at sort of some of the non-psychedelic compounds before I get into how we can potentially use psychedelic compounds for this as well. And so on the non-psychedelic compound side, CDP choline, or this is sort of the main ingredient in alpha brain, tends to be very useful. I know Joe Rogan and others have used it for potentially inducing things like lucid dreaming. I haven't found it to be useful for that, but I've found those types of products to be incredibly useful. Sort of anything that is alpha GPC, CDP choline, especially in a world where we're likely deficient in choline, that can be incredibly useful. The racetam family, I've found some of the racetams to be more useful than others. Aniracetam for me works well because it has somewhat of a net benefit on overall stress levels. But phenylpuriracetam and puriracetam, I think puriracetam was actually the first nootropic as coined by Cornelia Georgiou in the 1970s. But puriracetam, both of those can have net benefits to memory. I've played around with quite a bit some of the pharmaceuticals in this space, modafinil probably being the most famous one. Mm-hmm. I find modafinil to be useful for repetitive work that one does not like doing. That can include things like taxes, for instance. But it's not really good for me in creative work. And so modafinil, while it's still one of my favorite single ingredient nootropics, one of my favorite nootropics, I try not to use it too often because I value my creativity quite a lot. Some of the mushrooms are interesting, particularly.
Wait, which one is modafinil? Is kind of like hindering your
creativity. And this is anecdotally what I found, Max. And so modafinil works.
That goes along with my experience as well. I think it's a focus booster. But for example, I had one friend who was trying modafinil, like a little anecdote, to study for his final exam at university. That goes back several years. And he found that he was so motivated, but for a completely unspecific thing. For example, then he ended up researching the coordinates of oil tankers around the world instead of studying for So,
well, if he's an oil engineer, that's going to be useful.
But how he described it, was more, it gave him kind of like the motivation to do anything. But it was very narrowly directed on whatever he was focusing on. So exactly that goes along. I think what you said, you don't have that lateral thinking and then determining, okay, which connection kind of makes sense, but you kind of like just go.
And you hit on a good point with modafinil, right? If you have a very specific to-do list, and this is where that battle plan actually comes in handy, modafinil can be incredibly helpful. But if, let's say, you're an entrepreneur and you have 1,000 tasks at your feet, and you may not be able to figure out which one to do right away, modafinil can lead you down a whole host of different issues, meaning you might feel very focused, but you'll be able to do something for like 5 minutes and then 10 minutes, and then you'll be switching tasks a little bit too frequently, which for somebody who loves flow states as much as you, Max, I could see how that might be problematic. Some of the other ones that I've had the benefit of trying are, of course, lion's mane, which has a lot of interesting. Lion's mane, if you can get it in clinically effective doses, can be very helpful, and it's something that you need to take over a longer period of time. So, for instance, the Stamets stack, which involves the use of psilocybin and niacin as well, can be useful for point-in-time nootropic benefits. But if you take lion's mane in itself, you may not notice a huge effect the first time that you take it. And so, taking it over several days may produce a much better effect or a much better experience in people. Selegiline, which is actually a prescription drug as well. Selegiline is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, but also is prescribed traditionally for Parkinson's disease, can be used for productivity. I don't use it too often because I don't necessarily want to replace my body's natural ability to produce dopamine with something exogenous, at least at this point in my life. So it's something
How do you
that...
spell that?
Selegiline. Oh, Max, you're giving me a spelling test. Uh-oh.
Sorry,
No.
for the note.
Let's
You can
try.
also send it to me.
I will send it to you afterwards, but since you put me on the spot, let me see if I can get it. Seligene. That might be it, but please don't quote me. And whoever's listening to this on YouTube, I'm sure you can throw it into the comments because I may have spelled it wrong. Selegiline, there's a whole host of others. It's funny. I've built up a little bit of a database of these over the years, and now that I've begun exploring this world of psychedelics and microdosing, some of these substances actually do have a nootropic benefit as well. We can either save that for FlowFest, or we can get into it now if you want.
I would love to. By the way, I was just, because this is so interesting and I don't want to stop right now, I just moved a meeting I have a couple of minutes to the back, so I can't touch on that, Boomer, because this is just too valuable right now. And I really thought we had enough time, but the thing is, guys, when I have Boomer in front of me, of course we talk for about half an hour before recording because we need to catch up what has happened. And now we're recording, and now I notice I'm getting into time trouble a little bit. The good thing is, this is kind of the law of Parkinson, which means sometimes you get more done when you are under time pressure.
All right, rapid fire. Here we go.
Rapid fire. How has your experience been using microdoses of psychedelics? I know I'm shifting right now. We heard a lot of different compounds, and I wrote everything down, and you'll find more in the show notes, guys. But the psychedelics part, this is also highly interesting, and Boomer will talk a little bit more about that during FlowFest, and he's mentioned that also in Amsterdam. But how has that affected specifically your ability to perform? Because I think psychedelics are usually associated with integrative internal experiences where you close your eyes, you go on a journey. But have you noticed any effect on your productive output using psychedelics?
This actually might come full circle to that concept of superhuman that we talked about earlier. And frankly, I almost wish I could re-rack my answer, but I'll leave it there for now. So if you, and Max, you talk to hundreds, if not thousands of high performers, right? Like you talk to all of these people, and once you get to a certain level of performance, what really separates, those who are great versus those who become legendary is what's between the ears. Like the skill sets are almost the same. The ability to recall, to do something is almost the same. But really what I've universally seen in sort of what separates those people is not just this idea of mindset, but also, and maybe it is just mindset, but mindset, the things that go on between your ears and how you let that dictate your output. And so when I look at psychedelics, both in terms of micro and large doses, it's appropriate to share that I came at this particular adventure in my life by trying to look at ways to improve stress and stress resilience. I had, I mentioned earlier the issue with the cardiovascular situation, and when I started dissecting that issue, it wasn't the exercise, although I was doing too much. So I guess there is some component of exercise. It was dialing in the right diet. It was dialing in the sleep, but it was dialing in an area which I refused to acknowledge before, which was that I was stressed and I was experiencing stress. And I worked in an industry where you had to handle stress. And you had to basically never let people see you sweat. There's actually a Nelly song called Never Let 'Em See You Sweat. And that was how I lived my life for so long. So I came into psychedelics with the lens of, okay, how do I improve my perception and resilience towards stress? And so when it comes to performance, what psychedelics and microdosing psychedelics has helped me do is to help put stress in perspective. It allowed me to acknowledge the ephemeral nature of this reality, right? In the sense that I was able, by microdosing, I'm very quickly able to see and recognize that this too shall pass. Whether that's good or bad, whatever I'm going through at this moment will pass. And so if I'm able to keep that perspective, and eventually after microdosing for quite a long period of time, and I do it twice a week, and I have been for probably 4 years now.
And we're talking about psilocybin, right?
I think I do other substances. So in the case, I live in Amsterdam, so there's certain substances which are legal. There's certain substances which are gray area. So at least once a week, I'm microdosing some LSD plus some other compound, right? And this is a variation of LSD, which is currently legal. But I have in the past microdosed truffles because those are legal in Amsterdam. I do use other substances as well. And what I've found is it does allow me to give that perspective that whatever is in front of me shall pass. And so if it's an incredibly stressful moment, that perspective almost frees me from the prison of that stressor. And then the other thing is it helps with creativity. So allowing me to see patterns which may not have been available to me in a state where I am not microdosed, but also finally, in combination with some of these other compounds that we talked about earlier, whether it's lion's mane, whether it's selegiline, whether it's modafinil, you can actually unlock greater powers of those compounds. And so when I use, for instance, 1-PLSD with modafinil, I would say it's the benefits of both worlds. I get the creativity, but I also get the laser-like focus on whatever task I have at hand.
What a stack, yeah. Seems like almost like the limitless drug.
That was, in playing with these things, when I got into nootropics specifically, which was actually the first area of quote-unquote biohacking that I got into. We talked about earlier Quantified-Self-Institute, but when I started playing with the compounds, I came at it through how do I get my brain to perform better. And around that time, that movie came out, and I think everybody was after the idea of what is this limitless drug. And thus far, I haven't found it exactly, but I've come across several stacks that come close to it.
Wow. Now, Boomer, because unfortunately I have to come to an end, but we will definitely continue that conversation. But for someone, and I think we should mention that now, who hears that and says, wow, I'm so eager to try something like that. We already mentioned there's some gray area. There's some compounds that might be legal at the moment, might not be in the future. But what would you recommend to someone who is maybe starting this journey with these compounds, with all the risks associated with them? But what is a good starting point? What is maybe a roadmap, a step-by-step process that you could recommend?
Yeah, wow. Great question, Max, and thank you for asking it, because there needs to be a disclosure here, right? So what I'm disclosing is my own personal experience with these. Oftentimes, these either require a prescription a doctor's supervision or in certain jurisdictions aren't necessarily legal. So please, abide by your local laws and talk to your doctor before doing anything that I mention. But what I would say is education is priority here. And so making sure you educate yourself as to what these substances can do potentially in both high doses and low doses is incredibly useful. There's a site that I like because it makes it reachable to the general public called The Third Wave, thethirdwave.co. Paul Austin is a friend of mine, and he started that site, and I think he's a great educator. And so you can head over to thethirdwave.co, and that will educate yourself a little bit on this. The second thing, and this actually applies to all biohacking as well, so education on one hand, and then finding a coach or a medical professional who can help be your guide, be your Morpheus to your Neo, so to speak, right? That is certainly useful because Newton said that, I think it's Newton or Einstein, said, we're able to stand on the shoulders of giants, and that's why he was able to create things like calculus, etc. And, getting a guide to help guide you away from the substances that can be harmful, because certainly, especially when you're dealing with the amphetamines, a lot of these substances can be addictive and harmful, but also being guided towards the ones that can be therapeutic for you. So asking the questions that you're unwilling to ask of yourself, getting a therapist involved, because I will tell you, I've received 10 times the benefit of working with a therapist in conjunction in using these molecules than I have in doing them alone. And so having that combination of educating yourself, so empowered responsibility, plus getting that coach, that professional to help you ask the questions that you may not be willing to ask of yourself, that seems to me to be the right 1-2 punch.
Man, thanks for sharing that, especially also the website. I would have asked that at thirdwave.co. There's also a German institute that kind of developed that mission to educate people in that realm. I'm blanking on that one at the moment, but I'll put it in the show notes as well. Boomer, I know I should have now taken more time even with you. This should have been on my mind. Unfortunately, I have to wrap it up. But
my friend, I'm always available for you. So if you ever want to do part 2, if you ever just want to chat, I love talking to Max Gotzler. So this has been an absolute pleasure to be on your show.
Boomer, thanks a lot, really, for all the information you shared, for the work you do in this space. And you can tell already by listening to you that the things that you found to be working, they are working, because the verbal fluency, the presence, the stories you have, the compounds you know about, everything, like this has been a journey. At this point, thank you very much for coming on the show for the first time. I'm sure it was not the last one. And I'm very excited to seeing you in Munich.
I can't wait, Max.
This summer.
It's going to be so much fun. Thank you for making the time for me today, and I look forward to Munich Flow Fest. It's going to be just tons of fun with a lot of great people.
All right, and to all the listeners out there, of course, you'll find everything about Boomer in the show notes as well. Stay on for the outro right now, where I'll share more information about all your channels, about your website and everything right now. But at this point, just a big thank you to you, Boomer. I'm so happy to present you to the community finally as a true friend over the years, and even though distant, but you can see people, we are on the same wavelength. So until the next time, go for Flow. Yo, Flowgrader! Hat dir dieser Podcast gefallen? Dann abonniere diesen Kanal und verpasse keine Folge der Flowgrade Show mehr. Go for Flow!